The concert hall buzzed with quiet whispers as the orchestra prepared for rehearsal. In the midst of elegant musicians and polished instruments stood a woman who didn't quite fit in. She wore no designer outfit, held no prestigious degree, and carried only a weathered violin case. Many thought she was there by mistake. The conductor, a world-renowned maestro known for his perfectionism and sharp tongue, looked her up and down and smirked. With an exaggerated bow and a mocking tone, he invited her to show what she's got, clearly expecting to embarrass her in front of everyone. Some of the musicians chuckled under their breath, while others exchanged curious glances. No one expected much. She hadn't trained in the finest schools or played under famous lights. She was just a simple woman who had once played in local markets and family weddings. But what no one knew was that behind her quiet presence was a life full of struggle, perseverance, and a deep connection to music that came from the soul, not just from notes on a page, as she lifted the bow to her violin. The room held its breath. Would she fumble under pressure? Would the maestro get the last laugh? Or was there something more to her than anyone could see? The moment her bow touched the strings, everything began to change. But what happened next wasn't just unexpected. It would become the talk of the entire music world. As the first few notes echoed through the hall, something shifted in the room. The mocking expressions slowly faded. Her fingers moved with a kind of ease that only came from years of unspoken practice, from nights spent playing under dim lights, surrounded not by adoring fans, but by silence and shadows. She wasn't just playing music, she was telling a story. One of hardship, quiet resilience, and untold dreams. The kind of story that doesn't need words to be understood. The maestro, still holding his baton in midair, was no longer smirking. He was staring, confused, unsure of what he was witnessing. He had seen technical perfection countless times. But this was something different. It was raw, honest. Emotionally, in the back row, one of the younger violinists leaned forward, eyes wide. He had spent years studying complex pieces, but he couldn't look away from her hands, her rhythm, her feel for every note. Whispers began to stir again, only this time they weren't jokes. They were questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why hadn't anyone heard of her before? The truth was, she had walked away from music once. Life had gotten in the way, family responsibilities, financial struggles, lost confidence. She'd traded concerts for quiet living and her talent for survival. But deep down, the music had never left her. And now, standing in front of the very people who had dismissed her, she was about to give them something none of them would forget. The room held its breath as she moved into the second piece, a more challenging one, filled with sharp turns and fast transitions. Her eyes were closed now, completely absorbed, as if the piano had become a part of her. But while her performance deepened, the tension behind the scenes was just beginning to surface. In the corner, a well-dressed woman, clearly part of the event's organizing committee, whispered something into her phone, eyes darting nervously toward the stage. She hadn't approved this woman to play, and now she wasn't sure if she should be embarrassed or impressed. Meanwhile, the maestro stood frozen, arms crossed, ego silently battling reality. He had made a public show of inviting her to the piano as a joke, never expecting her to actually take the seat. His pride was now tangled in the melody she was weaving. He had students in the audience, peers, even journalists covering the concert. If she outshone them, what would that say about him? Among the crowd sat a teenage girl holding her mother's hand tightly. She had once loved music too, until a failed audition broke her spirit. But now, watching this woman, ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in expressions, something stirred inside her. It was the beginning of a quiet inspiration, as the final notes of the second piece lingered in the air. The room remained silent, caught between disbelief and awe. But somewhere in the back, a few began to clap, slowly, hesitant, unsure. The moment teetered between validation and rejection. The hesitant clapping faded almost as quickly as it began, swallowed by a thick, uncertain silence. The woman at the piano opened her eyes slowly, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. She didn't smile or bow, she simply looked out at the crowd, as if unsure whether she'd crossed some unspoken line. The maestro's face remained unreadable, his jaw tight, eyes locked on her like a challenge unfulfilled. He stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the wooden floor. Each step raising the pressure in the room like a tightening coil. In the audience, people exchanged glances. Some were clearly moved, whispering their astonishment. Others wore skepticism, perhaps still caught up in the fact that she didn't belong to any music school or renowned circle. One man leaned toward his companion and muttered, "She's got talent, but that doesn't mean she deserves this stage." A ripple of doubt and envy moved through the room, exposing the deeper tension. This wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about tradition, pride, and the fear of being outshined by someone unexpected. Backstage, a stagehand nervously watched the curtain, unsure if he should cue the next act. But there was no next act, not yet. All eyes remained on the woman, still seated quietly at the piano, as the maestro now stood just beside her. He raised his hand slightly, signaling something. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone knew it wouldn't be ordinary. The air buzzed with suspense, hearts pounding for what was to come. The maestro's hand, raised in silent gesture, suddenly dropped in dismissal, but in invitation. He turned to the orchestra behind him and gave a sharp nod. Confusion rippled through the musicians, but they obeyed. Instruments lifted, bows hovered, and the strings began a soft, uncertain swell. The woman glanced at him, startled, then back at the keys. It was clear he wasn't dismissing her. He was testing her again. This time, not with a solo, but with a full orchestra behind her, following no sheet music. Just instinct and trust. Whispers ran through the audience like wildfire. Some believed he was trying to sabotage her, set her up for failure in front of a full hall and a professional ensemble. Others weren't sure what to make of it. But the woman sat up straight, took a deep breath, and placed her fingers gently back on the piano. She didn't ask questions. She began to play, and then, just as the room started to settle into this unexpected collaboration, a voice from the balcony rang out, sharp and accusing. "She's not even listed in the program." A man in a tailored suit stood, waving a folded piece of paper. This performance wasn't approved. Who let her on stage? All heads turned. The spell was broken. Stagehands froze. The orchestra faltered. The maestro's jaw clenched. The woman's hands hovered above the keys once more, but this time, not from hesitation, something was shifting. The crowd didn't know whether they were witnessing a breakthrough or the start of a breakdown. The woman didn't flinch. As the man in the balcony demanded explanations, she calmly placed her fingers back on the piano and began to play. But this time, it wasn't just music. It was a story. A haunting melody rose from the keys, one that seemed to quiet every corner of the auditorium. Even the man holding the program slowly sat down, his protest silenced by the sheer emotion pouring from the stage. The orchestra, unsure at first, followed her lead. The maestro, now humbled, stepped aside and let her take control. Every note she played echoed with purpose, as if she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. The audience was transfixed, drawn into a performance that didn't need words to explain its power. The tension, the doubts, the mockery all melted away with the music. Then, just as the final chord rang out and the room held its breath, the twist unfolded. An elderly woman in the front row stood up slowly, tears in her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old photo. In it was the same woman on stage, but much younger, seated beside a grand piano with none other than the maestro himself. Gasps filled the room. The audience realized they hadn't just witnessed a random performance. They had seen a long-lost student return not as a guest, but as someone who once walked away from music after being belittled by the same man who now watched in awe. The silence turned into thunderous applause. As the applause faded, the woman slowly stood from the piano bench, her eyes scanning the crowd. Some were still wiping tears, others were whispering in disbelief. But all were looking at her with something they hadn't before respect. The maestro, once so proud and rigid, walked toward her with his head slightly bowed. He extended his hand, but words didn't come. She smiled gently, accepted the gesture, and for a brief moment, felt like time had come full circle. Later, backstage, a young girl from the music school approached her hesitantly. "How did you play like that?" she asked. The woman knelt beside her and said softly, "You don't need permission to be great. Just never stop believing in your own sound." That moment became more powerful than any headline or viral video. It was the passing of something real: courage, wisdom, and heart. News of the performance spread quickly. Blogs and social media lit up with phrases like "Simple Woman Stuns Classical World" and "Unexpected Piano Performance Earns Standing Ovation." But for the woman, it wasn't about fame. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that had once been silenced.